The agenda this week gauged the bottom line of the Golden Arches. We also considered the divestiture of government assets and calculated budget making with former finance ministers. The agenda's Week in Review now begins with Tory's Toronto. Here's your friend Royson James writing in the Toronto Star. He says, just because you're a police officer, you can go around harassing citizens, ask personal questions for no apparent reason, and maintain you don't have to tell your subjects why they're being questioned. That's the outcome of a compromise the mayor trumpeted last month, one mediated by a retired judge, authored by Chief Bill Blair, and foisted on the declawed chair of the Police Services Board. It's being roundly excoriated, as it should be. Either they don't give a damn, or they are deaf to the concerns of some people, or they are very dense. That's Royson James in the Star. Do you still support carding?
Well, I support the need to reform the policy, and let's go back. I mean, what we had was a kind of carding policy that was not subject to a policy of the board and to a set of procedures established by the police, and there was a bit of a vacuum there where I don't doubt for a second there were people who were being treated improperly and were being sort of, I'll call it, harassed in the streets, in a way where there was no need for it. And so in that sense, we brought forward a policy which I thought filled a vacuum, and the notion, Steve, that we thought it was perfect is set aside by the fact we said that very policy would be reviewed in 6 months, now 5, and reviewed completely and independently. And so we thought it was a step forward, and I still believe it was a step forward to have a policy in place and a procedure where previously the police service hadn't been able to agree with the Police Services Board on such a policy. Is it perfect? No, by no means. Am I aware that people are as unhappy as Mr. James suggested, or some of them? Yes, I am.
Do you see it as a racist policy?
I see it as a policy that has not achieved the objective of what we're seeking, which is bias-free policing. And I think this was a step towards that, and I believe that as we review it and refine it and improve it, it will take us even closer to bias-free policing, which is the objective. Make no mistake about that. And the reason, in my saying we have to move to bias-free policing, I'm acknowledging that there has been policing before that has been biased. And I think we have to fix that. It's an absolute imperative that we should, as a matter of the Charter of Rights, as a matter of morality, and so on. But, there are people who will not give us the time or even think about whether or not we tried to move the ball forward to some extent by having a policy that did acknowledge that people had rights not to talk to police officers and things like that, which were not enshrined in any policy before.
Did you read the Toronto Life piece that Desmond Cole wrote?
I did.
And
I find that kind of lived experience of people like Desmond Cole and many others, and I've spoken with him about it, to be completely unacceptable in the city of Toronto. There should not be anybody who can say they've been stopped 50 times, let alone even 5 times, without any reason whatsoever. The objective, of course, of carding, which I think has now been found to be not achieved, was to get people talking to police officers. And I think what causes that to fall apart in terms of the kind of exchange you want police officers and people to have is that you're starting to write down a lot of information, which then goes into a database, which later can turn out to be something that is used against someone when they're trying to find a job or whatever. And I sort of think now that what I believe Chief Saunders is going to do, which is to severely restrict the amount of that information that is kept on file, to start to, as he's used the word, stop random encounters on the street and make them, more focused on some reason to talk to people, is the direction in which we're going to move. But the people who have decided that they're, really ardently against what we did, in good faith, I would tell you. I mean, I would ask people who are watching tonight to look at my track record. I would ask people, even in the black community in particular, to look at my track record at speaking up for them on human rights issues and all kinds of other things, and being a friend to them and someone who they have supported, and ask them if they think that I would consciously ever, be supportive of any policy that was itself racist. I don't argue it's perfect. I argue it was a step forward on the road to much more progress and reform that's needed. That's going to be achieved before the review, but it's also going to be achieved by the review, which will be independently done now in 5 months.
Okay, item 2, the Gardiner. The Gardiner Expressway, for those who live outside Toronto, is that expressway that goes along the waterfront. It's been falling apart for years. The city has spent, probably hundreds of millions of dollars fixing it over the years. Here's what David Ryder said in the Toronto Star, describing the options that are available to you at the moment. He says, option 1 is a full teardown of the eastern portion of the Gardiner. The cost is projected to be $416 million. You'd build a boulevard, something like University Avenue, to take its place. Option 2 is the hybrid option, so-called, which would cost $919 million, This option would leave the elevated connection to the Don Valley Parkway, which goes north-south, takes people out to the suburbs, in place. Now, you came out last week and said you favored the hybrid option. How come?
Because I believe that with the congestion problems Toronto presently faces, and people who live here know, and people who visit from around the province that are watching will know as well, that we have a congestion crisis in Toronto. It's not just about families and individuals in their cars. It's also about commerce and vehicles that are delivering goods and so forth. And every study that's been done, without exception, shows that if you take the Gardiner down, you lengthen people's commuting times. And there are debates about how much you lengthen it, but the principle to me, and I ran on this, by the way, and got elected, with me saying that I would not favor any option that lengthened people's commuting times.
Even by 3 minutes?
Well, I mean,
which is what they say
the 3
here.
minutes is on one end of the spectrum, and on the other end we have 10 minutes. And you know, people will say, it's only 10 minutes. And I'll say, well, how about if it was your life? And you are already spending 80 minutes commuting, which is the average commute that many people face in the Toronto area, and we're just adding 10 minutes each way. So we're going to add 20 more minutes to that commuting that takes them away from their families or makes their job less productive or makes them unable to sell. And so to me, and all we're talking about here, Steve, by the way, is to continue to have an elevated express connection between the Don Valley Parkway, which runs north-south, and the Gardiner that runs east-west. And that's what we're talking about. And the hybrid simply moves the present one to allow for thousands of new jobs to be created on a piece of land that's occupied by some of the current expressway. And the cost differential you made reference to, by the way, is not taking account of present value. The present value of money actually has the cost differential at about $100 million, which is a lot of money. But if you said to me, when it cost the economy $37 million a year, if you tore it down in increased congestion cost to the economy, I'd say that it looks like a pretty good deal to spend the $100 million, keep the elevated expressway in place. I believe it is the common sense thing to do that takes account of the reality of a life in a big city, which is, yes, you want to have as much public transit as you can, but there are still people and goods and services that need to use cars and trucks to get around.
We talk mostly policy on this program, but we do talk a bit of politics, and I want to ask you about the politics of this. The politics of this, I wonder, are you afraid of being seen as anti-car? And that's one of the reasons you're supporting this thing.
Oh, no,
excuse me,
You're
right.
of being seen as anti-car.
Pro-car, forgive me, yes. Are you afraid of being seen as pro-car, anti-transit by supporting this thing?
Under my watch, billions of dollars will be invested in public transit. My first budget invested $100 million in the TTC after my predecessor had cut bus routes, cut late night service, cut service to some of the most isolated neighborhoods in the city. Under the budget that I brought in, children 12 and under get free use of the public transit system, which I hope will build transit riders of the future. We are getting on with building the Scarborough subway, Smart Track. The Finch LRT is being built by the province. The Crosstown Eglinton line is being built, and those were started before I got here. We are building more transit right now in Toronto than ever before. All I'm saying is you have to have a balance. I want to keep that traffic moving for the good of the economy, for the good of families, and for the good of the environment, for that matter. And so I am coming up with what I believe to be a balanced set of priorities, including building transit, but also including keeping traffic moving.
Okay, you mentioned the Scarborough subway there, so let's go on to the third of the three subjects that we want to talk about. This is quoting from, this University of Toronto study, which you've heard all about. The people who did the study concluded that of all the possible combinations of transit investments for Scarborough, by far, the worst case scenario is the combination of Smart Track and the Scarborough subway extension to Sheppard as approved by City Council. Not only will those two lines be too close to each other so that they will compete with each other, but they also run through areas with little potential for redevelopment and intensification and low population and job densities. This is the worst possible combination of conditions to build a rapid transit line within an urban area. So say Andre Sorensen and Paul Hess, U of T. Are they right?
I think that there is an imperative on us to make sure there is more job creation goes on in Scarborough and more continued redevelopment so everybody doesn't locate downtown, so that we can help to create ridership for the Scarborough subway. And of course, one follows the other. When you build that subway, people will more likely locate commercial and industrial enterprises out there and residences because they will be able to take a train downtown. As for the question of Smart Track and the Scarborough subway, there are studies going on right now to look at the riderships and determine the facts. Those gentlemen, with great respect, have not had the benefit of those studies yet because they're still being done. All I would say to you is this. Here is what I inherited, Steve, and I think the viewers will side mostly with me, not unanimously. All three governments agreed prior to my time as mayor, the city government, the provincial government, and the federal government, that there should be a subway built there, not an LRT. They had the debate 10 times, if not 5 times, but they had it a lot of times. They all agreed not only should it be a subway, but they would pay for it, and they
Why
put
did
up
they
their
come
money.
to that conclusion, do you think?
Well, look, it's not up to me to judge that. I think in a way they came to that conclusion because all you were doing is extending the Bloor-Danforth subway. People sometimes read about this, especially outside of Toronto, and they'll conclude we're building a brand new subway that's kind of all by itself in the middle of nowhere. This is simply extending the existing Bloor-Danforth subway to the Scarborough Town Centre, which is kind of the downtown of Scarborough.
Is this a kind of an issue that you're prepared to go to the mat for because you think the Scarborough subway, as it is currently constituted, makes so much abundant sense, it's not worth re-looking at it again?
I'm only saying to you, I'm not out horse trading or persuading anybody of anything now. I've stated my position. The councillors are very clear on what that is. And I'm worried that, for example, one of the things that could happen if you know, I heard a provincial minister, the Minister of Economic Development, who's from Scarborough, said he would fight to the death if somebody tried to change this. Yeah. I've heard, you know, conversation to the effect that the federal government might withdraw their money. And all I say to myself is, how would it look if we had a transit project that we were ready to proceed with, that all three governments had said they were going to move ahead with, and that then the City Council changed its position again on this, and the other two governments said, for example, we're taking our money and going home, and then we'd end up with nothing in Scarborough.
Well, you'd end up with an LRT, which
no, you wouldn't. If the province said, well, we're not playing in that game because we wanted a subway, and the federal government said we're withdrawing our money, you might end up, the federal money, I admit you're right, was not going into the LRT, but if the province said, well, we're not playing because, you know, we said we wanted a subway, so that's why I didn't want to open this can of worms up again and just say, okay, whatever the merits and demerits are, and there are arguments on all sides, better not to reopen it, better to proceed with what all three governments said. Rarely in this country do we get that agreement with their money attached. It wasn't just a promise or an empty commitment. They had their money and move on with it. So, but the universe will unfold as it should.
Give us some sense of how this works in terms of your relationship with the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister come to you and say, here's what I need you to achieve? Or does the Finance Minister go to the Prime Minister and say, here's what I want to do, please sign off on it? Or what?
No, the finance minister has to take the lead because the finance minister is the one who has to bring down the budget. We had campaigned on bringing the deficit down from 5.8 or worse to 3. It became
5.8%
of
GDP. Percent of GDP.
Yeah.
Because the number was, I mean, it was 40+ billion or something
at the
time,
which was that's right.
Which was high for back then.
Yeah, but the real problem that we faced was that not only was it 40 billion, but it was very clear that if there was anything went awry in the international financial system, our interest rates are going to go through the roof. If our interest rates went through the roof, it wasn't going to be 40, it was going to be 60 or 70, and we were Greece. That was the fundamental issue that we really had to deal with at that table, which is why the debates were certainly no holds barred, because they couldn't afford to have people being necessarily polite and proper.
Now, one of the things that you and Joe Oliver, the current finance minister, may have had in common is that you at the time were relatively new to politics and the Prime Minister had been in for decades. And Joe Oliver is relatively new to certainly his portfolio, but also to politics, and Stephen Harper's been around for decades. How does that dynamic play itself out?
It didn't play in our case at all. The finance minister essentially had to achieve that 3% target, and it didn't take very long after the first budget. It would be very clear that we had to go all the way and eliminate the deficit. And the only way it was going to happen is if the finance minister played his role.
So far we've been talking about the relationship sort of between you two with him. But I presume, I mean, you're the civil service and you're the political advisor. I assume you two had to lock horns a lot of the times as well, because what might be kosher for the bureaucracy might be, politically a tin ear. Yes? So did you two go at it a lot?
We didn't, actually. It was quite extraordinary what happened at finance. I think because of the magnitude of the task that we were all facing, we couldn't make a mistake. There had been too many failed attempts to balance the budget. The issues and the timing were so serious that we had to get it right. So I think there was a real sense of mutual respect on both levels that deepened as we get to know each other. I think the minister's right that the very relaxed discussions that he has with his own staff at the political level, the fact that that he's a great listener and a consensus builder, brings people in from the outside all the time, I think really opened up those doors between us and the department. I think the department reached out to me right from the start and said, we want to work together. If this is going to be a success, we have to make it a success at the financial level, at the fiscal level, with economists. We need you to make it a success internally with your caucus, with your cabinet. We're only going to do that if we work together.
Let's try this. Every budget, of course, is both a financial and a political statement. Your first budget was still years away from an election. Joe Oliver's first budget is 6 months before an election. How does that change the calculus of what you want to do?
Well, it didn't change our calculus at all. I mean, we came in with a very clear plan. We were going to essentially, first that plan was to basically get to the 3%, but very quickly, certainly after the first budget, when we realized the credibility problem that Canada had, it was we were going to eliminate the deficit. But we were not seeking to eliminate the deficit as the ultimate end. Elimination of the deficit was a means to a greater end, and that greater end was growth. And the reason for that is that if you do not have economic growth, then you're going to have a succession of deficits, and we wanted basically to get this monkey off of our back. The second thing is that more important than the deficit, although the deficit was the symbol, was the debt to GDP ratio. And we had one of the worst, if not the worst. We had the worst, except for Italy, and Italy had largely borrowed from their own population, a debt to GDP ratio of any of the major countries, of the G7 countries. And so the pressures on us not to make a mistake were huge. And that's really, but also the pressures on us to deliver. And it became very clear after the first budget that the next budget was the one in which it had to happen.
And that's the one where you allegedly broke, I guess as they say, you broke the back of the deficit in that 95 budget.
Yes.
But as you go into...
But it was part of a longer-term vision. It was, how do you build growth in the economy? That's what and we were very clear, and we went out to see Canadians. We told the consultation process with Canadians was crucial. And what that consultation process was to say to them, and I'm on record as saying this, we're not here to simply make an arid balance sheet look better. We're not going to protect our social programs unless we deal with this issue. Our health care, our education, whatever it may be. Those are not going to be protected unless we succeed. And it was growth was the ultimate goal.
Take us back 2 decades, and what were the arguments back then for privatizing all of Hydro One?
Well, I guess the main argument for privatizing Hydro One, or any asset, I guess, is that it brings some private sector discipline to the operation. And there are those, of course, who've argued over the years that hydro, whether you're talking about OPG or Hydro One, has sort of been out there on its own and runs its own way, and there's a lot of things that could be improved in the system. So that's the primary argument for doing it.
Not to mention getting the money back.
As I see it. Well, yes, but I think one of the things that people forget about is that there are literally billions of dollars that need to be invested in capital infrastructure of Hydro One in this case. And I don't see that this proposed sale is going to take us there. The money's going to be taken to pay off debt, and then the remaining balance, about $4 billion as I understand it, is going to go towards transit projects in the GTA.
Okay,
not that there's anything wrong with that.
I get you, but hold off on that because we're not there yet. So you looked at privatizing it back then.
I did.
You ultimately didn't.
Well, we didn't for, I guess, a couple of reasons. I believe that if you're going to privatize something, you should have competition. And there's no competitors here for Hydro One. I mean, it is the main distribution system of electricity and power for the province of Ontario. There are some 70 smaller distributor agencies, which Ed Clark pointed out should be probably consolidated. And I agree with that. But I think we should go there first before we even think about doing the second step. And I think he pointed that out in his report a few months ago. But even having said that, I think one of the other main factor that really made an impression upon me was the cost of hydro and the cost to the consumer. And as you may or may not recall, I certainly do, there was a big debate between Dalton McGuinty and I. He was going to keep hydro rates where they were. I was going to keep hydro rates where they were. And I really wasn't convinced that not only did I want to create a private sector monopoly to deliver hydropower across the province, I wasn't convinced that you could keep a lid on the price of electricity across the province of Ontario and its distribution, in this case with Hydro One.
Of course, Ed Clark, who's of course been tasked by Premier Wynne to study all of the government-held assets and see whether or not they can be repurposed, he said this is the best solution for keeping rates lower, because the private sector discipline you talked about will make Hydro One a better operating company, and therefore you'll have some opportunity to keep a lid on rates. What do you think of that argument?
I don't think that takes into account the literally tens of billions of dollars are going to be required for capital infrastructure improvements. I presume they're going to come out of the customer's pocket as well. The private sector is going to expect a return on its money. That's going to come out of the consumer's pocket as well. So I'm not sold on the idea that that is going to be the case. I think you could have looked at selling a minority interest in Hydro One to bring that private sector discipline. The problem with that, though, is that they're not going to realize as much return in the markets on Bay Street as they would by doing a majority. And I've had these arguments explained to me when I was Minister of Finance and when I was Premier. I was never against selling any asset that made sense. If it was going to deliver better services to the people of Ontario, and it was going to be cost effective, and there was going to be a competitive element to it. I mean, when you go right back to the beginning of the Harris government, we looked at OPG, what is now OPG, and Hydro One, and we always came to the conclusion then that selling the generation aspect, OPG, would make more sense than Hydro One. You wouldn't lose control over the distribution system throughout the province of Ontario. As Sean Conway put it once, I believe, he said it was like the lifeblood of the central nervous system of the province, and it was worth literally billions upon billions of dollars, and I believe he was correct in that respect. I mean, it returned $1 billion to the people of Ontario last year in income. Well, if you're on the street in the capital markets and you're going to sell a business that is regulated, a monopoly, guaranteed that you'll get at least $1 billion a year ad infinitum, the price tag would be a heck of a lot more than $9 billion, $4 billion net after you pay for the debt. So that's the problem I find with some of these arguments. I really don't think it's in the best interest of the people of Ontario.
McDonald's is ubiquitous. You can find the Golden Arches almost everywhere in the world. But its strong global presence also makes McDonald's a bit of a target. It's faced criticism for its nutritional values and has shouldered responsibility for expanding waistlines. This, coupled with increased competition, has resulted in a significant drop in worldwide sales. Joining us now for more on the future of the Golden Arches, in San Francisco, California, Orly Ashenfelter, professor of economics at Princeton University. And with us here in studio, Sarah Kaplan, professor of strategic management at U of T's Rotman School of Management, and James Cowan, editor-in-chief at Canadian Business Magazine. And it's great to have all of you on our program again as we look at what's going on at McDonald's. Let's just, if we could, Mr. Director, sir, bring up some of these numbers here because they are large. There are 1,400 McDonald's restaurants in Canada. That's part of a worldwide empire, which is 33,000 restaurants strong. There are 80,000 people who depend on McDonald's for their employment in Canada alone, and around the world, 1.7 million people employed by McDonald's worldwide. This next graph, however, is not as pleasing to look at. This is the change in monthly U.S. same-store sales in McDonald's, and you can see from 2010 till about the beginning of 2013-ish, it was all looking pretty good above that line. But then as of 2014 on, those red bars are starting to go below the line, and no business wants to see that. Okay, let's get into this. Sarah, why is McDonald's doing so badly?
Well, I think they're facing a number of challenges that are really important that have to do with just global trends. A lot of that has to do with how people want to eat these days. They're much more interested in healthy food. They want to know where the food is coming from. They want more selection. And so they're moving to a different type of restaurant. Restaurants like Panera Bread or like Chipotle, which is now entering Canada as well, quite a big presence in the US. And so McDonald's has a hard time meeting these changing consumer demands. So that would certainly be, I would say, the number one most important reason that they're not doing well.
Orly, what would you add to that list?
I tend to agree. I'd put it a little differently. I think in the developed countries, now I want to distinguish here between the developed and the emerging ones, but in the developed countries, they're facing a problem very similar with their brand to what many other companies are facing. Same thing's happening in beer. Miller and Bud are now losing market share to the craft brews. I think it's the same problem. Basically, in the wealthy countries, people have used the advantage of the brands, food safety in the case of McDonald's, and that value is just not quite what it used to be when people want to move back to the sort of understanding where the food came from, how it's made, and so forth. So I think McDonald's is not the only company that's going to face this problem. Brands that have this long history of commercial success but are very uniform, I think are going to face increasing problems.
James?
I think part of the challenge that they've had is they haven't been able to figure out a key strategy of where to go. They've tried a whole bunch of different things. They've tried going upscale, they've tried doing a dollar menu, they've tried selling chicken wings, and they've never really stuck to any of these strategies long enough to figure out whether or not it's actually going to be a winning one for them. And part of the problem is, as Sarah was saying, they've tried to move upscale. They're trying to meet up with this Chipotle trend, and they're not doing it very well. They can't beat that company at its own game. And so rather than trying to go back to their core basics of what they're good at, which is making Big Macs and French fries, they've been trying all sorts of different things and doing all of them very poorly and sort of making a hash of the strategy while they're at it.
Well, this is the thing I don't get, because you say, healthy food is in and you can't get healthy food at McDonald's. Well, that's not true. You can get healthy food at McDonald's. You can have a chicken Caesar salad at McDonald's if you want to.
Right.
So why do people say this? It's not true.
Well, it's very interesting because they've even tried kale salads,
Yeah.
So they've tried sort of the more healthy things and wraps and other things like that. People don't buy them, they don't sell well. So that's part of the problem is not that you can't get them there, but that people don't expect the McDonald's brand doesn't coincide with that kind of food. And so people, when they end up going to McDonald's, that's not actually what they want. A few people want it, but not enough. And the other problem is that those kinds of foods and the other kinds of trends that we're talking about, they make a hash of it, in part because it has nothing to do with how they do business. The way McDonald's works is it's very mechanized, very systematized, and they can be the same McDonald's that you get in Berlin or in India or in Los Angeles or in Toronto. It's the same because they have a system.
That's supposed to be the attraction, though.
That's the
You know what you're
attraction.
getting wherever in the world you go.
And the problem with all of these kinds of things that we're talking about in fast casual restaurants is that it breaks that system. If you want to start customizing, that takes longer. But the reason you go to McDonald's is because you get your food really fast and you get your food fast through the drive-in. So there's nothing that they've tried that actually still fits within the model of how they've learned how to succeed.
Orly, I note that the average meal, for example, we've been talking about comparisons with Chipotle. The average meal at McDonald's is about $5. The average at Chipotle is $9. Does that suggest that these two businesses are serving different markets and therefore we shouldn't be too tough on McDonald's not being the same as Chipotle? They're not the same as Chipotle.
I agree with that. I think that's right. The key to McDonald's is really the commercial aspect of the brand and the fact that they have things that are standardized across countries, within countries. A second point, though, that I didn't mention earlier, I should, though, is McDonald's itself has become increasingly expensive. If you compare, as I've done, what it costs to buy a Big Mac to what a worker who works in a McDonald's makes, that's actually slipped in Canada as well as in the U.S. So they can no longer get 2 Big Macs per hour of work. They're getting less than that. So that McDonald's, I think, has another problem, which is they're becoming a way more expensive than they should be. They probably should be half the price of the Chipotle's, not more than half.
James, does that ring true with you?
Yeah, and what I was going to add was we've become sort of people who watch watch McDonald's and what's gone wrong have been obsessive about the comparisons to fast casual because that's the segment of the market that's growing really quickly right now with Chipotle, with Five Guys. But if you look at the traditional competitors to McDonald's, the Burger Kings, the Wendy's, the Taco Bells,
Harvey's.
They're all doing really well as well. They're not growing as fast as fast casual, but they're doing fine as well. And so it's not strictly this notion that McDonald's has to move upscale that is getting in their way. In fact, trying to do that and driving up their prices is probably hurting them. It's that they've sort of abandoned their core market without finding what the next market is going to be for them.
Let's start with this, Nolan. What was the good job that you used to have that you gave up to become a photographer?
I was an engineer running around tunnels 180 feet beneath Manhattan. I was actually a technician working at an engineering firm.
And what was wrong with that job?
It was not creative. Although it was exciting, it was not creative. And I had that creative bug, and at my 30-year crisis, I quit and bought a camera. And next thing you knew, I was driving around the country in pursuit of all manner of photo essays on rural Americans.
So tell us about the McDonald's project. For starters, where the idea that going into a bunch of different McDonald's restaurants around your country would somehow pay off in lots of absolutely fascinating, riveting images to look at.
I was actually working on a different project that was taking me around like different rural states in the East Coast or on the West Coast, and I was using the internet in a McDonald's in Nampa, Idaho, when this gentleman walked in, and I actually don't have his photo released yet, who had a gun strapped to his belt. It was Idaho is an open carry state, so you could carry a weapon. And he walked in, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, I have to take his photo." So I grabbed my camera, and he was kind enough to let me take his photo. And I was about to post it to Facebook when, within 10 minutes, this little girl walks in wearing what appears to be just a blanket and some sandals. And I was like, this can't be real. I think there's a photo series here. And sure enough, and I started, as I was working on this other project, I started poking into McDonald's all over the West Coast, and soon enough, this series got on the roll.
So a couple of things to unpack there. Number one, it was the sort of ordinariness of everyday America that you found fascinating. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. And it's I'm from a small town, a small city in rural Washington State, and I guess although I lived in New York for so many years, I get sort of nostalgic. So it's fun to go on these road trips and like sort of be in the and pursue photo projects, that portray my people, if you will.
That is the Agenda's Week in Review. You can see all of those programs in their entirety on our website, theagenda.tvo.org, on our iTunes channel, and on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.